So please, Ross.
Okay, I'm terrifically pleased to be here, and I've got to say, doing the course with on socialism with Andrew a couple of years ago was a terrific learning experience for me. I hope it was for students, but it was an incredible pleasure, an intellectual pleasure, to spend the time relating to Andrew and getting the benefit of his incredible knowledge, and sometimes even disagreeing with him.
We sometimes disagree, it's true.
Anyway,
not on today's topic, by the way.
What I want to talk about, the topic today, I'll explain what the topic is today, and then we'll talk about it, and I hope I won't talk too long. I want to start by what I think this course of Andrew's about. He may not agree with the characterization. Is socialism as a tradition. And I learnt a lot about traditions from the conservative philosopher Alistair MacIntyre. It gives an idea of tradition is, as it were, a debate or an argument conducted over time. So that when you're part of a tradition, you identify yourself and your intellectual, in this case political project, with predecessors, a whole range of predecessors, and you think it's your responsibility to engage with them, talk about things. Now, the reason I want to think that socialism is a tradition is that in it we want to do justice to the past, to a certain past, and we also want to make use of that past to understand the present. Now, the point about traditions is they can provide resources for understanding the present, but traditions can be exhausted. In a sense, at a certain point, they don't provide the resources. You have to shift perspective, something like that. So the question, I'm doing a course like this, a question that I'm engaged with, a question that Andrew's engaged with, is the question of what it means to be a socialist today, to identify with a tradition, but it's also to say that this tradition gives us some kind of insight for understanding and changing the present and perhaps constructing the future. Now, the good thing about traditions is it gets away from two things which I think are bad intellectually and bad politically. One is essentialism. It's like socialism is really this, and anything else is not that. That dialogue with that is part of coming to terms with tradition. But in the first instance, we think of tradition broadly to include anything, and there'll be border disputes, that counts itself or has been counted as socialism. So we don't, for the moment, say what is essential to socialism. And something else that's important, we don't take the origin as crucial. It doesn't have the priority that origins sometimes have in religion, constitutional law in this country.
Yeah, of course.
The second or third step is just as important as the first. And what we've got to ask now, and to put it bluntly, traditions become exhausted when they sink into dogmatism, refusal to face certain things. And then you're dealing with zombie traditions. They're not living anymore. So I hope that socialism is not a zombie tradition, but it's a living tradition. Now, second thing I want to say about, within that tradition, socialism, political project, and I want to identify two aspects. One, I'll call a structural aspect, and that is a more or less definite conception of what the future might look like. And allied that is a usually more definite criticism of what the present is like. But socialism has some aspect of delineated in some perhaps rough, sense, with the utopians, even specific sense, what a socialist future might look like. And the second aspect, that's what I call the structural aspect. The second aspect is the value aspect. That's the idea of what are the values that we're making use of to criticize the present, and also what are the values we expect to see embodied in the future. Now, my thought is these two aspects are interdependent. And background to the talk I'm giving today, that was not one that I'm going to say much, is that we don't understand values unless we understand how they might be put into practice. And we don't understand the practice unless we think of it in terms of certain values. However, just one point, that characterization of the two aspects, picture of the future and values, I'm going to talk about Marx a bit later on. Not as much as I'd like to, but a bit, because I often thought that Marx gave no indication of what the future would be like. He didn't want to write recipes for cookbooks of the future, and that he sneered at talk of values. I think that's both misunderstandings. So I'll try and say something about that towards the end. Now, one thing about the limits of what I'm going to talk about today, and particularly about values, some of the challenges that socialism faces today, one of the key challenges about the environment, challenges about the exhaustion of natural resources, the destruction of the world, the possible future of the world. And traditional socialism has nothing to say about that. Things you can get out of it that might be relevant, but it's not an issue. If socialism is going to be a living tradition now, it has to show itself able to respond to that and say something. But I'm not going to address that today. So that's one issue. Okay. Next thing I want to talk about is that in recent writings about socialism, there's been an emphasis on, I say the two aspects, an emphasis on the value aspect. The conventional wisdom is that the two main strands of socialism of the 20th century have ended, they failed. That sort of the state socialism, communism, post-Bolshevik Sovietism, led to economic stagnation, political oppression, social demoralization. They died without significant struggle on its defense. And the second tradition is the, what I call the social democratic tradition, reformist socialism, parliamentary socialism, things like that. In the basis of the thought that they have both failed, there's a move to, as it will, rethink the socialist tradition. And the basis of rethinking has often been, well, let's look at socialist values, let's look at the values that are embodied in the socialist enterprise, and see then what structures will instantiate those values. Now, recent example, the one I'm going to talk about most, and perhaps you've had time to read a bit of, is Axel Honneth, the Idea of Socialism. Honneth argues that the basic value underlying the socialist project is what he calls social freedom. And this is a conception of freedom that involves solidarity with others and equality. Say so. John Roemer, who we're going to talk about later in the course, says that the basic value underlying socialism is equality. And he gives an account of equality in terms of equality of opportunity, what he calls equality of status, equality of opportunity for self-realization, stuff like that. Jerry Cohen distinguishes between what he calls socialist principles, the underlying values, and the what does he say? The organizational, the socialist modes of organization. And again, he talks about the socialist principles, and for him, equality is the basic principle. Equality and community. Okay, now I'm going to be concerned here not with Romer or Cohen, but with Honneth, that the assumption they all share is it's possible to have a conception of socialist values in abstraction from the way these are institutionally or practically embodied. All right, so let me talk about Axel Honneth. Now, Honneth argues that, what I'm going to do is provide a summary, and then I'm going to interrogate certain aspects of the view. He thinks the normative core of socialism is what he calls social freedom. And the notion of social freedom, in this book, he says, well, if you look at the principles of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, he substitutes solidarity for fraternity, so will I. He said, well, prima facie, there's tension between liberty, equality, and fraternity. So that the problem is how to give a notion which gets rid of that tension, makes them coherent. And his notion is social freedom, and that is the idea. The idea here is that when we look at human activities, the most significant human activities require recognition of the freedom of others. If I want to know more about socialism, and I go to Andrew and talk to him about it, and if Andrew wants to know more, he wants to know more about socialism too. Now we've got to both recognize that we're bringing to bear different viewpoints. Argument, conversation presupposes some recognition of some degree of autonomy of the other. Now let's call this recognition, and it emerges in lots of human activities. When you professional help for something, when we fall in love with somebody, we seek friendship, all sorts of things like that. What we want is something that recognizes, in certain respects, the independence of the other. Now, sometimes we're contrary. Sometimes Sartre is very good on bringing out the ambivalence. When you say, well, we want to control the person we love, but we want to recognize the freedom of that person as well. But put aside that ambivalence for a moment and think, okay, there's a notion, if we think that the important human activities involve recognition, they are intersubjective, then that allows us to construct a notion where my freedom depends on the recognition of your freedom. And as soon as we articulate that, Honneth says, okay, that is also going to require that we recognize the equality of the other, and we recognize that we exist in some kind of community with the other. So that notion of social freedom, he argues, allows us to, as it were, get the three concepts of liberty, equality, and fraternity together as well. Now, one of the reasons I'm talking about Honneth is that I think, by the way, he's right to think freedom is the important value. And I think what he calls social freedom is very important. I want to argue, if I have time at the later, we've got to go a bit further than social freedom, but nevertheless, it's very important. Now, his argument, and I think in the passages that I provided extracts from, I put it down there, socialism, the normative force of the idea of social freedom, is prevented from unfolding its true potential by a theoretical framework stemming from the Industrial Revolution. So what he thinks is things go wrong because the socialists, in some way, incorrect way, the early socialists, and that includes the young Marx, but he's looking at earlier people, earlier like Owen and others. He finds this notion of social freedom there, but for them they're dealing with industrialization. And that, he says, the influence of the horrors of industrialism lead them to produce a distorted analysis, a distorted framework for understanding the application of social freedom. So what happens, and basically reading it is a bit irritating because you want to know who he's talking about. And sometimes, and you want to argue that this is wrong. But putting that sort of stuff aside, very often it's Marx that he's talking about. Sometimes it's Saint-Simon. But the others really get a walk-on part. So he says, well, what socialism ends up, and this basically is like Marx, or if you like, a caricature of Marx, but it's the Marxist thing, is that the antiquated intellectual structure that he thinks defines 19th century socialism has the aspect what he calls economism, the thought that capitalism is the problem, as the only problem. Get rid of capitalism, things will be all right. That means that in the socialist tradition, there's no adequate recognition of the importance of politics. There's not adequate recognition of the importance of political freedoms. There's not an adequate recognition of the importance of citizenship. So the notion of social freedom is interpreted in fundamentally economic terms, to be realized in the workplace, in the organization of production and things like that, where it's assumed that the rest of society will take care of itself. So there's no real discussion of political democracy, no conception of citizenship. Socialists also argue, again this is mostly Marx, that the force within capitalism, which is the most, suffers most from it, but also is the force that's going to overcome it, is the industrial proletariat, the industrial working class. So the addressees of the socialist project and the agents of the socialist project are industrial working class. And the third problem is the doctrine of historical necessity that socialism is written into the, as it were, textbook of history. It's the next move. So he spends a lot of time, not in the chapter I gave you, but a lot of repetition. If he only said things 3 times, the book would be half as long. It's not a very long book. How do we overcome this antiquated intellectual structure, political structure, in the 21st century? Okay. First, we've got to realize that socialism is not merely an economic system. Social freedom is to be realized in all spheres of human life. He takes over from Hegel the idea that there are 3 fundamental spheres of human life. What Hegel calls civil society, which is fundamentally but not only the market and market relationships. Then what Hegel called the family, which he interprets to include this realm of personal relationships, friendship, things of that kind. And finally, the state, politics. So Honneth argues, socialism, we've got to take a richer view of society, and the notion of social freedom has to be embodied in all these spheres. He blames Marx for conflating capitalism with the market. Background here is something you're going to get a lot of in this course. It's again, it's the accepted wisdom now that the idea of a totally planned economy doesn't make economic or political sense. So that some form of the market is more or less inevitable. Now, that's something, some form of the market. What does it mean by that? And so that's something we might talk about today, but you'll certainly be talking a lot about in this course. A quotation there from Honneth: "The most important task when it comes to reviving the socialist tradition consists in revising Marx's equating of the market economy with capitalism, thereby opening up the space for alternative uses of the market." So in other words, take for granted the existence of the market, some form of the market, so we must investigate, discover what forms of the market are going to be appropriate for socialism and what forms of the market not. He goes into the way in which we discover this, and here he draws on Dewey, and I'm going to have a fair bit to say about his drawing on Dewey. We get experiments. What is right about the problem with revolutionary socialism is that you seize power and then you've got to create socialism. But it's starting from scratch, as it were. Capitalism didn't develop like that. Capitalism developed over centuries. So that somehow you've got to find a way, if we're going to construct a form of socialism that's going to work, there must have a role for trial and error. So he thinks that somehow we've got to find the space for experimentation in the modern world. However, the experiments need to be guided by the core values, social freedom. So we'll send a copy of Honneth's book to everyone to read, so they make sure they're properly recognized with freedom, things like that. And this may mean that we end up with something which doesn't mean a planned economy, doesn't mean social ownership of the means of production. In other words, the notion of socialism, which doesn't include what is traditionally thought of as the main elements. And finally, and something, this experimentalism, again the influence of Dewey and Habermas and influence of critical theory, stuff that I want to hear later what Andrew has to say about this. The experimentalism involves expanding the sphere of communication, so that communication plays a key role in A+C. Experimenting, finding other people to experiment with, communicating results of the experiment, and so on. And this communication will create the conditions necessary for socialism. That's the plan. Okay, that's a sort of summary. Let me now talk about a couple of things, a couple of aspects. Something he calls the normative force behind socialism. To be quite honest, I don't have a clue what he means by normative force. But I think that's not because I'm stupid, I think it's because it's an incoherent notion. However, that's another issue. I'll say what I think he means, my effort. Honneth rejects the idea that the industrial proletariat is the privileged agent for capitalism. But he accepts the idea that socialism, if it's going to work, must find some potential for change within the present society. And the potential for change must be something which is both has force, that is power, that's in a position which it can change things. Proletariat is a critically strategic position within capitalism, but also somehow embodied the norms. I hate the word norms, and I'll explain why I hate it later. Honneth language explains the norms that are embodied. So what you need to find in capitalism is this kind of normative force. Agentive power, normativity, strength, normativity, moral power, something like that. Now he criticizes analytical Marxism, Cohen in particular, by saying, well, they construct the concept of justice and say that's what socialism realizes without looking for what in society will achieve that justice. And he wants to draw on Castoriadis and Römer, both of whom you're going to be, and Habermas, for saying that they are on the right tracks here. I've got a quote there, I don't know, I gave it to you, that he in favour of against socialism, a purely normative alternative, and in favour of the tradition exemplified by Castoriadis and Habermas, retains the thought that socialism must reflect on its own conditions of possibility and aim to bring about an alternative life form. Again, socialism must conceive of itself as a movement directed towards the future, aiming to make modern society more social in the full sense of the term by unleashing forces or potentials already in society. So where does he find the forces and potentials? So I've got a long quote there in the extract I gave you, so I'll read out and I want you to think about it. According to Dewey, the normative guidelines in the experimental search for the most comprehensive answer to a socially problematic situation must be thought of as the removal of barriers to free communication among the members of society so that problems can be solved in the most intelligent fashion. Dewey's argument reveals something about the evolutionary force upon which a revised version of socialism could rely if it wishes to be an expression not of a moral imperative, but of a historical tendency. As history unfolds, potentials are unleashed and realized by the establishment of connections between hitherto isolated individual things. So what I say is, he ascribes this to Dewey and takes it up, that communication between groups not only creates new knowledge, but it also creates the power, the force that's going to potentially create socialism, move towards socialism. So the normative force is actually created by these extended patterns of communication. Now, I think this is bullshit. But it's, all right, another quote there. I shouldn't have said that. Have I offended somebody? Socialism must be viewed as the specific modern articulation of the fact that in the course of history and on the basis of varying social circumstances, new groups constantly seek to draw attention to their own demands by attempting to tear down barriers to communication and thereby expand the space of social freedom. In each case, the only possibility of attaining such recognition is to invoke already implicitly accepted norms and thereby to demand the right to have a say in the formulation of social rules, thus removing another barrier to social communication. I think the bit I gave you, I italicized a couple of passages, which are my italics, but I want you to look at those. So extending the scope of communication New groups want to extend, excluded, marginalized groups want to extend the communication, so they break down barriers to communication. In breaking down communication, they make use of norms already present, I emphasize that, to say we need a place, so women excluded demand a place. They make use of norms, equality, things like this, which they can then use to racially minorities can do the same kind of thing. That's the kind of thing. Now, what do I want to say? Break down the barriers to communication. What does that mean? I mean, I don't know what it means in Dewey, but you can imagine the barriers of communication where we're not allowed to talk, where some people have access to typewriters and telephones and other people don't. Breaking down the barriers provided. Now, in a sense, we've broken down the barriers to communication enormously with the internet and all this. There are no barriers to what socialism needs is new forms of communication. It's not breaking down barriers so people can talk to each other. It's forms of communication which allow argument, debate, not forms of communication which simply allow interest groups to coalesce around each other. So the whole question of what is the phrase breaking down the barriers, as if communication just leads to the things to be taken away. We've got to create the appropriate forms of communication through which people can understand their situation, and hopefully to understand that this situation needs the kind of transformation to new social structures which you could identify as socialist. But creating those is part of the problem of building socialism. It's not something that's something to be done and then we use that to build socialism. So it's a whole set of problems there which is smuggled under this idea of removing barriers to communication. Now, the idea that communication itself creates a force I don't see anything that looks like an argument for that. Perhaps the closest come to it is when groups are able to articulate their demands for inclusion, their political force is important. Now, here again, the phrase Honneth uses here is crucial. What he says here, in each case, the only possibility of attaining such recognition is to invoke already accepted norms. And therefore, what does it mean to invoke already accepting norms? The norms that are already prevalent in society. Now, there is, to some extent, the point to that. The example of women, for example, racial minorities, where you can say, okay, you promise equality, and we don't get it, why not? We have whatever the grounds are, something like that. So that in a sense, leaves the existing norms intact. So what is implicit here, and it's something that Römer says explicitly, Cohen says explicitly, I'm not sure that Honneth says explicitly, what you end up, socialism turns out to be radical liberalism. We take the values that already exist in society and make them consistent, make freedom more consistent by recognizing material inequalities, things like that, and then we get as close to socialism. Now, that may be right. Nothing I'm going to say is say that's wrong. However, it does miss something which is important in the socialist tradition, which we want to revisit. That is the idea of creating new values, that going beyond the values that are present. within existing society. All right, how am I going for time? Yeah. Let me say something about experimentalism. Honneth talks a little bit about the kinds of experimentals in early socialism, communicative. He doesn't say enough about it. Actually, 19th century socialism, no in the English case more than the continental case. You find lots of interesting things like education, schools, attempt local schools, cooperatives, cooperative banks, things to try to raise money, all sorts of efforts on the class of working class people to get education, to get the financial capital to do other things like that. So I think that kind of thing is important. He doesn't say anything, if you think of experiment, and if you think along my lines of socialism tradition, we have to say something about the two major experiments in socialism in the 20th century. Sovietism and social democracy. Now, okay, I'm not going to say anything about Sovietism, I'm not going to say much about social democracy. However, Honneth, I quote a bit here, speaks of socialism's, and these are quote, rapid and silent decline soon after the end of World War II. Socialism's rapid and silent decline. Now, a lot of people think of the end of the 20 years after 1904 as the high point of social achievement in the 20th century. Not particularly my view, but however, you have social democratic parties both in power in certain places and certainly in other places influential through the trade union movement, and also influential as the capitalist economies tried to combat the threat of communism, Soviet communism, by making certain concessions. This is a period in England, again, which I know better, where you get a national health scheme. You get something like free education. You get an enormous amount of money spent on social housing. And what else? Now, these are kinds of things that, Bernie Sanders calls him a socialist. This is socialism on the burn. Now, the question of whether this is socialism, what we all radical left people, good right-thinking people like me, and I thought at the time, I was wrong by the way, that this was a sellout. This wasn't socialism, because it was actually coming to terms with and in some time just helping the capitalist system work better. The question now is, who are we now to say what's socialism, what it isn't? At the moment, it's our responsibility to look back as socialists, our intellectual responsibility and our political responsibility, to look back at socialist experiments and see to what extent they were successful and to what extent they weren't. Why they succeeded when they succeeded and why they failed when they didn't. Now, that was the what happened. The failure of, say, social democracy largely was an economic failure. The economic crisis of the late 60s and early 70s, of high inflation, unemployment, stagnation, where traditional Keynesian remedies didn't seem to be working, was also the intellectual and political success of the new right. Neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, which had been waiting in the wings and developing intellectually in various think tanks and places like that, predicting a consistent, and the problem for them with social democracy was not that it was a failure, but that it was a success. They thought that social democracy was a step towards socialism. It was state control, providing of social benefits, unemployment benefits, things like this, strong unions. All these things stood in the way of capital accumulation, capital development. So you got an intellectual and political attack, which was largely successful. Now the point here is not to resurrect, and I'm not going to do it, we're going to talk a bit about it later in the course, not to resurrect British labourism, or for that matter Swedish labourism, which I'm going to talk about, is to say, well, okay, when it worked, why did it work? What were the conditions of it work? And what were the problems? Why didn't it get the, as it were, loyalty of its people who benefited from it? Why did they end up then, now, voting for opposition parties, things like that? I've got one of the just episode. When I have a friend in London, and he, his partner and a couple of kids, live near Barbican, in an area that was bombed in the Second World War and rebuilt after the war, and it was working class housing. And they're living it. Why? Because it was sold up by Margaret Thatcher. She not only crushed the trade union movement, social welfare, she privatised all this. However, there it's several, many acres of land. There's a bit of high rise for single families and couples. A lot of low-rise houses all opening out into open space. So there's a place where when I was there, kids could play, there were no, and parents could be sitting looking at them doing other things, and where there were no traffic, no transport. This is central London. There's kindergartens, medical facilities, swimming pool, things like this. Now, whoever built that, whoever designed it, had some conception of how people might live and live together. It was creative. So the thing about looking back at social democracy is finding the creative things and recognizing it wasn't just its own momentum that destroyed social democracy, it was a concerted and successful political attack. Okay. Finally, how am I going? Final bit is where I want to talk a bit more about freedom, and I also want to talk a little bit about Marx. Honneth's notion of social freedom is actually based on, he has another book called Freedom's Right, which is reading of Hegel's philosophy of right. And the notion of social freedom really is Hegel. No, obviously he doesn't. It's a modification, but a reading of Hegel. And if Honneth is anything, he's a Hegelian. Now, let me make an assumption which I think Honneth would share, and I hope you will share. That social and political values must always be contextualized, in the sense that values emerge in the context of social change. They emerge in the context where people living through certain social changes try to work out how to come to terms with these changes, what to do about them, and the articulation of values is part of that. Now, and you get philosophers like Hegel, who, writing the philosophy of right, is giving a philosophical reading of the kinds of values that are emerging in given certain social changes. Now, what was Hegel's understanding of those social changes? Well, it was largely based on a reading of 18th century political economists. And most of those were the Scottish political economists like Adam Smith and Ferguson and others. Not just them, but that's their conception of, they call commercial society and he calls civil society. So his notion of freedom, his analysis is based on what we would call a market society. It's not based on industrialization. If you read Adam Smith, there's no discussion of industrialization, Adam Smith. This pen is what, that comes a bit later, and industrialism and capitalism comes later. The word capital comes, Smith doesn't use it except in a not the way we understand it. So what I want to suggest is that if we understand socialism and socialism's response to industrialization, capitalist industrialization, we've got to not look at the values of the French Revolution, not the values to be found in Smith, but the values that socialists were trying to produce. And the person that's most important here is Marx. So I just want to say something about Marx's conception of freedom. Now, this is going to take me 10 minutes, 15, is that all right?
Yep.
Are you patient? The problem talking about Marx and values, because Marx, like Marx's conception of future society, Marx and values, he sneered at these things. Now, I think a proper reading of Marx would give you something like this. Marx rejected morality, but he rejected morality in that sense that morality was constructed by Kant. Morality as universal, applies to everyone, at base ahistorical, and prescriptive. So once you understand what value is, what morality is, you realize the imperatives of morality apply to me. Marx, now when Honneth and Habermas and talk about normativity, the word normativity is full of Kantian resonances. And it's about laws, the laws which apply. Marx didn't believe in morality in that sense. This is morality as Nietzsche described as slave morality, herd morality, Nietzsche's criticism. Bernard Williams talks about the morality system. Doesn't mean we don't believe in values, but we realize that the values we believe in don't necessarily apply to everybody. And if people are going to agree with them, we have to persuade them. No necessity. So of course Marx had values, and that's why I talk about values and not norms. I don't like that. Okay, so what were Marx's values? A lot of discussion that Marx really believed in justice. He didn't think he believed in justice, but I don't think that's right. Though Marx says things. One of the things about Marx involves the concept of exploitation. The simplest way to give an account of the notion of exploitation is the extraction, appropriation of surplus labour by one class from another. The extraction of a surplus. And it's fairly easy to say, well, there's some norm of justice that's offended in this. Now, this depends too much on theory of value, which even though sympathetic to Marx might want to reject, the labour theory of value. But it's also, if you look what Marx says about future societies and things like that, he knows that surplus labour will be extracted from the working population all the time. It'll be extracted for insurance purposes, for education of the young, for looking after sick people, for investment for the future, all sorts of things like this. So that a simple way of thinking, well, there's some note of justice. We just read, without too much attention, Capital Volume 1, you think, oh, it's just exploitation is extraction of surplus labour. It's got to be more complicated than that. Ultimately, it's extraction of surplus labour under conditions which you don't control, something like this. So as soon as you understand what's behind it, you're looking for something like notion of freedom. So I agree with Honneth that freedom is central, at least to Marx's conception of socialism. Where I disagree is I think he has a more ambitious notion of freedom. It's also perhaps a more vulnerable one. I'm not going to defend it today, and there's certain difficulties with it. And the simplest way to get at this notion of freedom is to look at the notion of alienation. For Marx, and Marx in this respect follows Hegel, alienation is the antithesis of freedom. In other words, alienation is the primary form of unfreedom. So to understand what he means by freedom, it's not about what he means by alienation. Okay. But to see what he means by alienation, we don't look at the early manuscripts. Obviously, we look at the early manuscript, but in a talk like this, we don't. We have to look at what he says in Capital. Now, alienation, the basic notion of alienation is when you are subject to a force, you're dominated by something which is in some sense you, but which you don't recognize as you. So something like that. So you've given over part of yourself to something. That something imposes itself on you. So it's force on me, but you don't recognize it. Okay. The two forms of alienation that Marx identifies in Capital Vol 1, one is familiar, commodity fetishism. Second, capital fetishism. And they're interesting because they both point in perhaps complementary but certainly different directions. Commodity fetishism, I've given a quote there, where the best way to understand commodity fetishism is what happens. Markets have always existed. The word market, by the way, Marx hardly ever uses and it's come into use. But markets, that is commodity exchange, has always existed throughout history. But what's happened in early modernity in the 17th and 18th century, the market becomes dominant in the sense that large amount of production is for market exchange. And in that time, market exchange assumes a certain kind of continuity. This is the period where the science of political economy gets started, and it gets started, amongst other things, an attempt to understand how the market works. And the discoveries of political economy, which Marx followed this, was that it works in a law-like way. Certain things happen, other things happen. Now that law-like way, it's as if the market is subject to laws which are like laws of nature, natural laws. So the idea that you'd have a science of the economy like you'd have a science of biology, a science of physics. Now, Marx thinks says explicitly, the idea that you have a science of economy shows that a certain sphere of social life is no longer under our control. And it's that lies behind its analysis of commodity fetishism. The idea that it's as if the value of something were a natural object of some kind, defined by natural laws. But the bizarre thing is that we are subject to these natural laws. And the quote that I wanted to get for you, if I've got it here. No, I didn't keep it. I saw yours. Where did I get from Marx? Yeah. But the bottom of the first, these formulae, which bear stamped upon them in unmistakable letters, they belong to a state of nature in which the process of reduction has the mastery over man instead of being controlled by him. Now, this is alienation. We are subject to something which, in a sense, we produce. It's ours. It's because we act together in market transactions, and this gives rise to certain regularities which are the subject of laws, but these laws also impose themselves on us. So we are subject to our own creation. The other aspect, now, what's the answer to that? Says controlling. When we come to understand this, so subject this process to social control. So that looks like a planned economy, something like that. The second important one, capital fetishism. For Marx, capital is simply embodied labor. So the capital confronts the worker as not her own present labor, but the labor of past workers, which has been appropriated and therefore is the power over the present worker. But it's simply not, capital is not simply a form of property. It also appropriates. Workers do not cooperation. Workers do not cooperate except when they are employed. And Marx has a lot to say about the enormous productive power of human cooperation. But under capitalism, you enter the workforce as an individual. Cooperation is organized through capital. So the results of cooperation are appropriated by capital. So you experience your own the cooperative power of individual workers, in the form of capital power over you. And the third aspect is that, and this is that capital also involves more and more scientific knowledge, more and more knowledge how to build machines, how to operate them. That knowledge itself is then appropriated by capital. So that the process of capitalism is the process of workers losing control, losing the capacity to control their own labour force. Now, the upshot of this, what is something like workers' control. In other words, the way in which this can be overcome is by workers in taking control of the labour process, and that is organising it for themselves. So the notion of freedom that Marx is using there is we are free to the extent we control the conditions of our existence. It's not simply freedom in terms of my relation to all new people, but rather freedom in the sense that we as a group control the circumstance in which we live together to the extent there. So it's a kind of that form. Now that form of freedom, by the way, is in Hegel. So for him, it takes the form, because Hegel is an idealist, ultimately, in certain forms, it involves the recognition of yourself in it. Marx, materialists, involves something more ambitious. You actually control it. It's actually your product, and you know it is your product. Now, one more thing. I think Honneth is right to point to the problems that the socialist tradition, in particular the Marxist tradition, have with coming to terms with the political dimension of freedom and the political necessity to come to terms with that. But that notion of freedom, which I've been articulating in the economic, has an earlier realization in political freedom. That notions of political freedom involve the idea that collectivities, groups, can control their political conditions of existence through some form of the democratic process, something like that. So that notion of freedom is not that not unfamiliar. And it may be, final comment, ultimately unsustainable in a world as complicated as the world we live in now. But that's another question. Okay, I think that's thank you.
Thank you very much. I will restrict myself to about maximum 5 to 7 minutes to give room also to the other colleagues and to the class. So this was really a fantastic introduction to what the course is supposed to do. I will focus on the narrower aspect of it, namely the problem of the values and how they relate to institution structures, projects, and so on. And I think in this sense, I'll stay close to the Honneth argument, which you reconstructed so well. Let me proceed in the order of controversiality. When I originally read the Honneth book, I thought I kind of agreed with a lot of it, but it was kind of also for me it was also truistic in the sense that things you already believe and he articulates are not such dramatic things. But now I actually, and I think this is also part of the result of your presentation, I think that there are more controversial aspects of this. Aside from the truistic ones, they're controversial aspects. So proceeding in the order of less controversial to more, I think that the claim that socialism represents a radicalization of the French Revolution and the various democratic revolutions is not really that controversial when it's put abstractly. Now, of course, we substitute solidarity for fraternity. Maybe even people would say, well, today we have to leave some room for difference, which is not really a part of that triad, but still we're pretty close to the 18th century. Of course, how we interpret each of these things, that's the question. So on the first level, I think a lot of you are probably with Honneth. When, however, he turns, a lot of us are with Honneth. Because even the concept of freedom you developed toward the end, which is a different one than his, is a possible interpretation of the triad. And it does not exclude the social freedom idea, it just wants to expand it. Okay, so that's the least controversial part of this. But then the next step, namely what goes wrong, already has some assumptions which a lot of you would find perhaps problematic or disturbing, probably I less so than many of you, but okay, still, let's mention them. Socialism is a product of industrialism. That's, of course, historically undeniable, but that it carries with it assumptions drawn from that epoch though undeniable, may not be considered a flaw by a lot of you. And these assumptions are three in this argument, right? One is the center on the economic centrism, which, by the way, he gets from Durkheim, who in his essay on socialism, as you'll see in this class, stresses that point, that's what socialism is concerned with, and Marx's life work. How can anybody deny that he's an economist concerned with the economy? So that's sort of, Honneth finds that to be problematic. Many of you won't, right? The second idea that when you discuss the reconstruction of that realm, the economy, you have an addressee, and that addressee is the revolutionary subject, the proletariat, which is certainly at the time of Marx's writing or later not the only class in society, but it is universal with radical needs. This is the Marxian language. This he finds problematic. A lot of you will agree with this, the way Honneth develops it, because he says there are a lot of other people, a lot of other groups, a lot of other strata with injuries, and why should we only focus on the injuries of one particular group? The others are equally relevant, and he himself obviously has in mind youth, women, gender groups who have suffered and still suffer exclusion, race, all the issues that we talk about in radical groups and circles is what he has in mind, and he says they're all important. And so some of you may still find this controversial because you would want to stress the proletariat or industrial workers more, but still this is something that we can still accept. And then the third idea, which is perhaps the most problematic, but still there is something to be said for it, is the historical necessity. That somehow history will also help whatever the project is, whether it is the project of the industrial workers or other forms of exclusion, other excluded groups. History, in some respects, favors their protest, their resistance, and their attempts to reconstruct society. Okay, you probably have problems with each one of these steps to some extent or another, but I think probably this is still, even if more controversial than the ultimate values, it is still, I think these are all propositions that can be entertained just in order to throw a monkey wrench into possible objection. I mean, already Lenin and Trotsky break with the determinism of the classical theory, so this happens within the tradition already, and surely Edward Bernstein rejected it also. So the main traditions in the 20th century accept this to a greater extent than probably some of us might prefer. But now comes the next step, and that's the communications model linked to experimentalism, and that's what you raised yourself as the problem. Let me start with the less controversial aspect, experimentalism. I mean, you know, even if you don't think that history is going to deliver the future for us the way we would like it, you still may have some difficulty thinking that it's a question of trial and error of all kinds of things, and see what works and what doesn't. That is really a pretty radical. It's not just an abandonment of determinism, but a very radical alternative to it, right? And to that I could say, defending Honneth, that even what were Lenin and Trotsky other than experimentalists? I mean, think about the introduction of new economic policy. We'll talk about these matters here. I mean, you know, war communism was tried. It led to all kinds of bad results, famines, hunger. So Vladimir Ilyich, and of course initially supported by Trotsky too, and then Bukharin becoming the most important theorist of this, shifted a very different model. I mean, isn't this a kind of experimental attitude too? Now, of course, Honneth nor do we mean experiments quite on that scale. But okay, you know, experimentalism, you know, at least on some level could perhaps be defended. But what is now the experiment that he has in mind? And that's the most controversial part, the communications theory. I mean, I actually would make more sense, because I'm closer to Habermas, make more sense of what it would mean to eliminate the blockages in communication. I mean, there are economic blockages. People who have no education are blocked. There are gender blockages because, you know, you even see at the new school, at the wonderful progressive new school, so many classes women speak less than men. There are gender blockages, clearly. And of course, there are political blockages in lots of places where people can suffer just for the communication. So removing these blockages is a reasonable project. That's the Habermasian project of the public sphere. But to expect this then to produce what he wants, namely the right kinds of experiments, and then consensus or at least agreement of some kind about the results of those experiments, especially when one is addressing so many different groups in potential conflict, that's problematic, certainly. I mean, what he tells us is not unreasonable that there are already in existing societies many elements which could be used by socialists. In Germany, he points out the co-determination experiment. I don't think one hears too much about it these days. I don't know what the fate of it is. But there are other experiments with workers' control, with different forms of property, with also elements of radical democracy using referenda, popular consultation of various kinds. There are things out there which are really radical, and certainly, if you're not thinking of the grand experiment in the style of Trotsky and Lenin, or for that matter, Stalin's 29 experiment, we might want to utilize the results of these micro experiments, of which there may be many. But how would you, in a communication process, convince people, right? If they were just a relatively freed communication process, convince people of the positive results of some of these experiments. I mean, we will talk about these topics in detail. Workers' control, which I find very attractive. Certainly for the new school, it would be great if the students and the faculty would again control the place, which they no longer, of course, do. So in some places where we, ourselves are located, this model is attractive. But think about the problem of workers' control in large industry. There are a lot of attractive aspects to it. It's democratic decisions are made. But on the other hand, you yourself has just pointed to this problem. There will be, what was the term you used, surplus value or the expropriation of surplus? Well, that becomes a problem for workers' control, right? Because what would workers wish to do, potentially? One thing, of course, they may want to do is to consume on a higher level, to satisfy their needs on a higher level, to support their families on a higher level. But there's also the problem of the longer term, and is simply a communication process adequate to resolve issues of that type? Or for that matter, as you see in the United States already, it's going to happen, the conflict between ecological and industrial needs and interests. I mean, yes, of course, abstractly we all want to save the earth, except for Donald Trump and the people around him who denied that there's a problem in the first place. I'm sure most unionists in the United States think there is a problem. Nevertheless, are they willing to do in their own workplace what is needed in order to stop carbon emissions? And can you just convince them in a communication model of what is the right approach, and that they should consume less, or they should accept perhaps less favorable working conditions for the sake of the environment? So this is the most problematic part of the analysis, and I think we need to think a little more about models, their coherence, their relations to one another, the relation of the various elements to one another, in order to have some sense about not the procedures through which controversies can be resolved, but what we would say in those controversies. In other words, to say that there are many attractive things out there, some of them may be even incompatible with one another, is not a replacement, I don't think, for socialism. One thing, and this I end with, Honneth says is very helpful in this sense, and of course it could be almost like an introduction to this course. He says someplace that we must construct an archive of the experiences of socialism. Now this would mean not only, by the way, and that's something that he doesn't say, it need not be an archive which only controls, which only contains experiments or political projects which we find completely attractive and compatible with the fundamental values and norms of socialism. I think the archive also should include the other experiences, and in that sense, revisiting 19th century socialist projects, revisiting state socialism, revisiting also history of social democracy in its different stages, and beginning to look at, and unfortunately my article doesn't do it, to look at cognate traditions like anarcho-syndicalism, anarchism, and see how that archive could be a richer archive on which we can draw. But even this, I don't think, will be a substitute for having again, which the men and women of these movements historically had, namely fairly comprehensive ideas about what a alternative social arrangement would be like, and I don't think that you can actually piece that together from the already existing traces of reason in contemporary political and institutional life. So I think there's need to do more than what Honneth even attempts in this book, although there are others who do attempt, because we will at some point look at Römer's book, and John Römer attempts to develop a fairly comprehensive model of what yes, in his case the interest is socialist economy, but what a socialist economy would look like, and I think that we again are going to have to do some of that. That does not mean that we wish to carry out totalizing experiments which would require the violent taking of power somewhere. But at least in some sense we ought to know where society could head, even if history is not going to guarantee those results. Okay, I stop.
I was using social democracy as an untheorized shorthand for reformist socialism, parliamentary socialism, sort of not necessarily, obviously Bernstein's classic statement of this. However, I had in mind particularly the kind of, if you like, Keynesian socialism of the post-war period. Keynes was not a socialist, but nevertheless, given the moral, political climate in the post-war period, the idea that the guys who'd fought and needed to be given something, the experience of the Depression, all sorts of things like that, you get reformist governments. And even this country, they're doing a lot in terms of social housing and stuff like this. But in other countries where people who actually thought of themselves as socialists thought this was the way forward. I don't think what I said was that project is thought of as a failure. Obviously, Axel Honneth thinks it's a failure. When I was younger, I thought it was a failure, and people like me were criticizing social democracy as a sellout.
Compromise.
Our criticisms had no effect. But the criticism did have effect with the neoliberals, and that was an example of a very successful political and intellectual strategy which we can learn from. So I think there are lots of successes in social democracy.
Just two short points on it. In our joint class, we came to the conclusion that at a certain point, social democracy was left without a further, without a project. In other words, it became conservative. To protect a project that was a good project, and of course had some successes. That's kind of hard to see in the United States, because many things that have been achieved in social democracies elsewhere would be dramatic departures with what we currently have. And you see this debate. I mean, healthcare, just alone healthcare would be a great example of that. But nevertheless, what if we did have that? What then? What comes next? We'll read Edward Bernstein's Evolutionary Socialism in this class. We'll have to make I still have to make a selection. Maybe I did already make a selection because of your note. You'll see that even Bernstein, on the one side, had pragmatic reforms in mind, and on the other side, his book has elements of industrial democracy, participation, new forms of solidarity in it, which no social democracy ever even realized. So even Bernstein's initial project, in some sense, was successfully concluded in some of its parts, maybe even more dramatically than he could have imagined, because in terms of living standard, he could not have imagined Scandinavian living standards for industrial workers when he wrote. Compared to Germany then, that would have been so dramatic to even imagine that. But a lot of things were achieved, and yet things which the early reformists thought about, to some extent, were left undone. And so in that sense, of course, there are answers to why this happened, which we'll also talk about in the course, but nevertheless, to call it an unmitigated success would be, I think, would be wrong.
The relation between Honneth's notion of social freedom and the liberal democratic, there's not one liberal idea of freedom, and that's one thing. What is standard amongst right-wing liberalism, neoliberals, is that freedom is purely negative. So basically, I'm unfree when you stop me doing something. I'm not unfree because I can't fly, because that's a natural limitation. But if I can't fly because you stop me getting on the plane, I'm unfree because humans have stopped me. So I'm unfree. Freedom is just negative. Now, others, Kantians, like to some extent, Honneth, think, well, that's an unsatisfactory. You need some notion of why freedom is important, and you've got to think of something like autonomy, something what Honneth sometimes calls reflective freedom.
Reflective.
That is when I don't just act as I want to, I think what I want. I can work out what I want to do and what I should do and things like that. So I bring to bear reason on what I'm doing, some notion of personal autonomy. So that's a move towards what's called positive freedom. It's thinking about the. But then he says further, well, it's somehow, and you say, well, however you conceive freedom, even if it's intersubjective. So I realize that my freedom depends on your freedom. I really want to know what freedom is, and in fact I do, and I like to about it. So I need people like you to ask me and come up with objections. And I may be irritated by it, but when I think about it, I'm gaining from it. So I realise that that my freedom then becomes this intersubjective element, that I realise my freedom as an individual depends on your freedom, so that I will look for social arrangements which provide for that. Now, Honneth doesn't argue much. He says that when I'm in that arrangement with other people who I recognise as free, I will also be committed to their freedom, to their equality. I'm not so monistic as Honneth. I'm happy to think that in certain levels there's a value of equality too. And that may sometimes have to be worked out how it works with freedoms. I'm happy to think there's a value of accepting equality too, which is perhaps sometimes in tension with freedom. I don't know. The philosopher in me likes them all to combine as one single value, but perhaps a few values are in place there. Certainly we're used to tension in all sorts of ways, you know, like my preference for my own children, together with my thought that all children should have an equal opportunity. You know, there's a tension there. How do I resolve it? I don't know. Yeah. So there's always going to be things to work out. Certainly part of it. Just one thing I want to say, pick up with if I were to credit Marx with a conception of a future society, I would say that with those two aspects of alienation. One, there would be a degree of social planning, and that is to say there'd be some organs or mechanism, ideally democratic, where the people decided how much was to be the areas of production, what to do, things like that, just global decisions about production and planning, how much, another question. But also the productive units would be industrial democracy. That industrial democracy wouldn't be complete. They'd be deciding how they would produce things, but often they wouldn't be deciding what they produced. That would be the matter for the larger collective. So there'd be that kind of, at least two levels in that kind. And I think whether that's the right way, any conception of socialism is going to have that. It's going to have a lot of the space for local autonomy, but for reasons that you said, even in a perfect society, there's got to be limits to that in terms of social planning and use of resources and things like that. Two questions there. The first question is what his notion of capitalism is, and I honestly don't know. I'm assuming that he has a pretty everyday notion of capitalism, roughly meaning not just private ownership of the means of production, but unequal ownership of the means of production, so that the major means of production are owned and controlled by elites, and other people have jobs for that or ancillary to that or something like that. So I think that's fair enough, but really I don't remember reading it, and the other stuff with Honneth I did when I was doing my homework for this, anywhere that Andrew might remember. He knows the tradition better than I do. The other thing is a question of why call this socialism, not democracy. I don't think too much hangs on that, because of my conception of socialism as a tradition. I think it's a bit up for grabs. I think, okay, I'm prepared, and then I would want to criticize that and perhaps regard some of the economic factors as much more important than Honneth obviously believes. But I'm not going to fight over the word socialism.
But Ulrich is right that if you actually say that this is a differentiated society now. Marx is wrong in just focusing on the economy. There are all these other spheres. There's culture, there's the state, there's family life. And we want to create social freedom as he defined it, which is some kind of combination of liberty, equality, solidarity, in all these spheres. And is socialism, is that the best term to describe it then? Or, on the other hand, and that is what you just basically said, socialism is the best term because the economy is the most important sphere of all this. If you say that, then yes, that's a reason. But Honneth doesn't say that. You didn't read it, but in fact you suspected right. He doesn't say that. And if you don't say it, then yes, democracy is a precondition of that kind of collective solidarity that he's interested in. And so in that sense, democracy would be the better term. But if you really say the economy is so central, Marx wasn't completely wrong about that. And I think we see the centrality of the economy. I mean, in my other class, I get into the whole question of what are the two central structural frameworks, the modern state and the modern capitalist economy, right? And so for one, democracy is the right term, but for the other, socialism remains the historical term we inherit. And we talk about, even in American electoral campaigns, they talk about the economy a lot, right? So it's not as if the economy is neglected, even in contemporary liberal democratic discourse. So that, I don't know if you agree with, if you'd still say the economy it is not the only sphere. You can't reconstruct everything just by changing the economy, so it doesn't have to be deterministic, it doesn't have to be reductionist, but still the economy's importance compared to the rest, or at least compared to most of the other spheres, can still be maintained.
In lots of respects, I remain a closet Marxist.
Well, that's why I think that would be.
I don't. Yeah,
that's
I
why I'm
agree
asking
with
you.
that.
But I'm not, and I still think that probably is right.
Yeah.
That is probably right. That we, of course, who would offer such a seminar, right? If we didn't think that socialism. I mean, I'm a little bit nervous about the term because it has been now discredited by a lot of people, and there's reasons for that. But I think still, in that sense, the economy and its reconstruction needs to be really talked about. And democracy doesn't. No, even industrial democracy, you could have, and alienation would survive. It would not be enough, right? I think what you basically argued just now when you suggested there is also a role for some kind of central intervention, which of course should be democratic. But industrial democracy on its own, how you put it, I think a lot of people would object to this, but there's reason to say it. You said not the what, but the how is what's decided by the industrial collective. That's what you said, right? The what you're giving to Gosplan, right? To the planning board. I mean, that's giving them a lot. That's giving them a lot. But there was a little,
Look, there's a different agenda here, a different thing here. If at some stage, or perhaps I was speaking in rather than invited here again, if I'm invited again, I'll give you a much more detailed plan. Question of how much of market remains, and that involves what areas we leave to the market and what we don't.
Well, of course, we didn't even bring in a market.
No,
that's another step.
I just assumed that
that's another big step, right?
But then, like that, okay. And unlike my comrade and friend Benoit, I believe there's need for central planning of some kind. That's got to be democratic. And how much planning, and how much is just coordinating, guiding the market, but providing hospitals and education or all the stuff that the market's not good at providing.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Okay,
but, no, but that's very, very important because it actually indicates, and certainly workers' control experiments also prove this, is that in a way, industrial collectives are more comfortable with the markets than with the central planner.
But there's a problem about this, which is the problem about workers' control generally, that you have any kind of ordinary market economy, it's got to have labour mobility. There's not enough recognition in the book. He actually criticised the socialist tradition for not recognising the autonomy, but the importance of the political, and certainly in questions of the political rights and political democracy and things like that, and associated with that, that he thinks that in the notion of a post-capitalist society, a socialist society, there won't be citizens, there'll be just workers, and the rest is left. Now, frankly, there's a whole lot of things. I actually think that his criticism, the thing about economic centrality, I think in a sort of watered down form, you and I both believe in it. Yeah. So I'm in good company, more than Honneth. The thing about the economic determinism, necessity, I think that was a bit of a, in the socialist tradition when it got down to it was background support when things were going bad. That history was on your side, but everyone believed you had to do a lot to bring it about. Even the Social Democrats thought it was. Yeah, they would talk about. I don't see the influence of that really as being as important as Honneth thinks it is. When it comes down, it's there in the theory, just how strong, but in the practice you find that it's a background assumption, it's not doing a lot of work.
Well, certainly as social democracy develops, it plays less and less role.
Yeah.
They don't care about it. Bernstein gave it up right away, but the rest took another 30, 40 years.
Well, God, did Lenin believe in historical component? Yes, he did, but he had to be given a kick along.
In the 19th century, by the way, and I think Honneth would admit this, there are pretty strong reasons to think that, because the industrial form was certainly moving in that direction. I mean, Marxists always saw that in the form of concentration, centralization, monopolization, and there were certainly strong trends in that direction. So this was not an absurd theory at the time.
No, you're right about that. Yeah. No, I think the kind of fetishized notion of the economy that Marx is criticizing, that this is a self-governing autonomous system that has certain laws, that does have its influence on the idea that there's certain dynamic of capitalism, and that's much more plausible than certain trajectory of capitalism. Whether you can then talk about a trajectory of history is much more.
But it's really, becomes very dramatic in Russian Marxism, right? I mean, the Russian populists always thought that you didn't have to go through the stages of the Western capitalist development. And for a long time they were attacked by the Marxists, but then Lenin and Trotsky also came to think so, right? That you did not have to do that. And then the determinism is over. If you can actually have Marxian socialism in Russia and China, what's left of determinism?
By the way, Gareth Stedman's book, biography of Marx, has a lot of stuff at the end of Marx falling over backwards to find shortcuts, particularly making use of in Russian material.
Well, he was corresponding constantly with these Russian populists and anarchists and socialists. And they told him, this община, right? This cooperative form of agriculture, which is always a part of the overall structure. You don't have to create private capitalism on the Russian countryside. You already have a quasi-socialist form. You just have to develop it. You have to give it more money, more funding, and of course get rid of the landlords and the Tsar. But this Marx for a while didn't want to buy, but then he did. And I think this discussion, you have it in India, something similar, right? I mean, basically Gandhi understood that you have some forms which are traditional, which could be perhaps developed and transformed, and they were egalitarian, right? They were solidary. So I think in some sense this idea was fated to replace the determinism anyway. But today I think Axel makes too much of that as a kind of burden. The proletariat is no longer such a huge burden either, right? Because which one of us would say, when we're talking about radical politics, well, look at industrial workers. We go back to industrial workers. We might think it's a very important group or a very important constituency, but we would not say the constituency, right? With radical needs that no one else has. I mean, it's on the left, no one talks like that. So that side that's also kind of gone. And in that sense, that's why I say that some of the books seem truistic to me, because we all kind of believe that. And, then the problem is, and it's a problem that all the way from Ernesto Laclau on the populist side to us, we all have to face, because if you have a variety of radical needs and a variety of actors and a variety of movements and no historical logic which points to a certain future, then how do you bring all this together in some kind of project of change and reconstruction? It becomes tougher for us than
point
for
I
Marx.
made about morality, when he said the thing about communication and groups
Right,
have to
right.
find norms that they can. Sometimes you can't persuade people,
Right.
and sometimes give people. That means what you do. It's a kind of Kantian nonsense that somehow you can only coerce people when there's reasons that they ought in principle to accept for the coercion. Sometimes it's something like a struggle where you win or you lose.
Yeah.
And so that's why I don't really believe in the communicative stuff that the critical theory tradition hangs on to when
Well,
it's
I mean,
playing a role in this, is the idea that basically there's grounds that are available to us all
It's
that
really
we will agree to. And
it's
that's-
weird, because Honneth, I would say, generally tries to distance itself more from Habermas than we would have. But on this particular point, I agree with you, and I'm kind of surprised. I'm kind of surprised that he says in the beginning he's not going to talk about how to get there. Well, that's always a problem. I think to actually neglect that issue, how to get from here to there. Obviously, you can't really, because even where you're trying to go, we could imagine very beautiful things, but if it's absolutely impossible to think of a way of getting there, maybe we should replace that beautiful thing by some other beautiful thing. I mean, we need to somehow link process and substance, right, in some way. And then after he has kind of said he's not going to talk about that, then he puts the communication model in the place of that. As if, everybody will agree to get rid of things that inhibit communication. Well, I think it's relatively easy to get large-scale agreement on that, although
I want to
even
inhibit
that would be
Rupert Murdoch's
100%.
communication capacity. There's lots of people's communication capacity that I would
But-
like to put barriers in. I would like.
That's it. There would be people left who would actually say, why should women be talking so much? I mean, it's not natural, or why should, people who have no education have an equal voice in politics to those who really are highly educated? I mean, there must be people around still who think that, right? So it's not even automatic on that issue. But then once you free the communication frame, than to agree on all the other things. So I think what you're saying is that there is also a question of power which has to be fought for. That's what I think you implied.
Well, ultimately, the power. The other thing about communication is that what the internet shows is, which is close to pretty universal communication. Everyone can have a say and talk, stuff like that. It's incredibly good for certain things, like if you're a gay young man growing up somewhere, it's great, you'll discover that people are gay around the place and you can communicate with them and get all sorts of stuff. So that's sort of rather beautiful. But if you're a racist, you'll find there are other racists around.
I mean, this is what we see now.
Them, and it's not as if you read other people. Unlimited communication enables minorities to get together and support each other.
And actually, some of us, as a result of this, would say, well, there are certain parts of communication should be limited. Why should, I think, how many of you would think that Facebook should censor lies? I kind of think that they should, right? Why shouldn't liars have equal freedom of communication to, well, they shouldn't, because that really pollutes communication processes. But that means we ourselves are not for the, well, I'm not sure
what
how
I'm
I
trying
would...
to get at, I don't think communication has the kind of privilege that the critical theory tradition gives it.
But only Habermas.
Well,
I mean, certainly Adorno never even mentioned it.
oh no, I think it's
Right.
The post-Habermas.
Yeah.
But it's here in Axel's book.
Yeah.
And
yet it's important,
I think
right?
it's important, but it's important like other things are important. It's not a fundamental thing, which is in terms of which we can explain morality or ethics or politics. Or it's an aspect of life, and communication is one of the problems about equality and liberty, freedom, and things like that. It's not somehow the ground on which we can